Language and thought. Try to think about something commonplace. For example, try to remember what you ate for dinner last night. As you remember this, be aware of exactly how you remember this. Pay attention to what goes on in your mind while you are remembering. Try to do this right now, without distraction, and then come back to reading this chapter. What did you notice? First, did you remember what you ate? If so, how did you do it? What was the form of the memory? How did you go about probing your memory for the information? You probably thought something like this: okay, what did I have? Oh yeah, I had rice and some of that spicy vegetable stew. Or maybe you thought, dinner, what did I have? I'm not really sure if I did have dinner. Whatever you thought, it probably involves some kind of inner monologue or narration. You probably asked yourself the question with your inner voice, which you know is part of your working memory system. You also probably tried to answer the question using language. The thinking and recollecting that you did as you considered different memories also involved your language. In other words, your memory retrieval was guided by language, and your memories themselves also guided your inner dialogue. Each time you considered a possible memory, you may have assessed its validity by using some language. And if you had to report the results of this memory search to someone else, you would absolutely need to use your language. Just try to think of something without using any language at all. It's possible, but not easy. Language and thinking are closely intertwined. So far in this book, I have been discussing the structure of mental representations and how those representations might affect the thinking process. The chapters on similarity, attention, semantic memory, and concepts were all concerned with this topic. You probably have a good idea about how complex thought and cognition depend very much on having well-formed mental representations. In this chapter, however, we are going to take a much closer look at how this interaction between representation and behavior works. Specifically, this chapter will examine the interaction between language and thinking. Objectives. On completing this chapter, you should be able to achieve the following. Be able to define human language. What are some of its features, and how is it different from other forms of communication in non-human species? Understand the role of language in cognition, especially as it relates to memory, ambiguity resolution, and conceptual metaphors. Gain an understanding of linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. What are some of the predictions of the theory, and how do those predictions hold up? Language and communication. We want to understand how language is used in thinking. The psychology of language as communication is a great place to start because language seems to be a uniquely human behavior. And it is plausible that our use of language in thinking arose from our much earlier and more primitive use of language as communication. Of course, other animals communicate with each other. Sophisticated communication is seen in bees, for example, as they rely on a system of dances and wiggles to communicate the location of nectar to other bees in the colony. When a honeybee returns from a nectar location, it performs a dance that corresponds precisely to the direction it flew and how long it was flying. It is communicating something to the other bees that is necessary for their collective survival. But it is not thinking. It has little choice in terms of whether or not to do the dance. It would perform that dance even if no other bees were watching. We agree that the bees are communicating and behaving, but they do not seem to be thinking or using language. Other animals have different modes of communicating. Songbirds obviously have a well-developed and highly evolved system of mating calls and warning songs. These birds' songs are unique to each species and require exposure to other bird song in order to be acquired. Dogs communicate with barks, growls, yelps, and the wagging of tails. And anyone with a dog knows that they respond to human language and nonverbal cues. Even my cat sort of responds to some verbal and nonverbal cues. These are all sophisticated means of communication, but we do not consider these to be language per se. Unlike human language, communication in these non-human species is fairly limited and direct. Bee dances have only one function, signaling the location of food. Bird song has a set function related to mating, and even though birds require some exposure to other birds' song, a bird can only learn its own song. Highly intelligent birds, like the African gray parrot, can learn to mimic the language of humans, but they are not using human language to carry on a casual conversation or advance an agenda. Even dogs, which are capable of very complex behaviors, are really not able to use communication abilities to consider new ideas, solve complex problems, and tell stories. The great apes, specifically bonobos and orangutans, are known to be able to learn complex symbol systems, but they are not spontaneously using language to direct their behaviors in the way that humans can. In other words, non-human communication and language-like behavior are used primarily to engage in direct communication or as a response to external stimuli. Non-human language-like behavior is not tied to thinking in the way that human language is. In this way, human language is remarkable and unique. One of the big questions that psychologists interested in this field want to answer is, do we think in language? Like many of the other questions that we have been trying to answer, this one is simultaneously trivial and nearly unanswerable. On the one hand, of course we think in something like a natural language. We began this chapter with a consideration of how language drives our thinking and helps us navigate our memories. We plan what we are going to say. We ruminate over things that have been said to us. We consider alternatives. We plan actions and think about how those actions will affect things around us. Most of this kind of thinking takes place in explicit conscious awareness with a heavy reliance on an inner voice, a part of the working memory system that was covered in Chapter 3. On the other hand, many of our actions and behaviors are influenced by non-conscious computations and are the result of System 1 thought. Rapid, intuitive decisions are made without much or indeed any influence by the inner voice. For the most part, the influential, dual system approach that we discussed in Chapter 1, also known as the default interventionist approach, is built on the idea that non-conscious or intuitive processes drive many thinking behaviors, and these often need to be overridden by conscious, linguistically influenced thought. What is language? It is clearly beyond the scope of this textbook to answer definitively the question of what language is and is not. That is not only too big a topic, but also an entire field of study with its own textbooks. However, we do need to have some basic definition of human language in order to understand the interaction between language and thinking. Early in the history of cognitive psychology, the linguist Charles Hockett described 13 characteristics of human languages. This list of design features is a reasonable starting point. Figure 5.1 shows the complete list of the 13 characteristics, along with a brief description of each feature. These are all features of human language that suggest a unique and highly evolved system designed for communication with others and also with the self, for example, thinking. Let's consider a few of them in more detail. For example, language is a behavior that has total feedback. Whatever you say or vocalize, you can also hear. You receive feedback that is directly related to what you intended to say. According to Hockett, this is necessary for human thinking. It does not take much imagination to consider how this direct feedback might have evolved into the internalization of speech, which is necessary for many complex thinking behaviors. Figure 5.1, 13 design features, from Hockett. Vocal auditory channel. Communication involves transfer between the vocal and the auditory apparatus. Broadcast transmission, directional reception. The signal can be sent out in many directions, but is perceived in one direction. Rapid fading, transitoriness. The verbal signal fades quickly. Interchangeability. A speaker of a language can reproduce any message he or she can understand. Total feedback. The speaker hears everything he or she says. Specialization. The vocal apparatus used in speech is specialized for speech production. Semanticity. Language has semantic, meaning, content. Arbitrariness. The signal need not refer to a physical characteristic of the referent. Discreteness. Language is composed of a discrete, finite set of units. Displacement. Language can refer to things that are not immediately present. Productivity. The finite set of units is capable of producing an infinite set of ideas. Traditional transmission. Language is transmitted by traditional teaching, learning, and observation. Duality of patterning. A small number of meaningless units combined to produce meaning. Language is also productive. With human language, we can express an infinite number of things and ideas. There is no limit to what we can say, what we can express, or for that matter, what we can think. but this can be achieved within a finite system. We can say things that have never been said before, yet the English language has only 26 letters. There are about 24 consonant phonemes in English, and depending on the dialect and accent, there are roughly 20 vowel phonemes. Even when allowing for every variation among different speakers and accents, it is clear that this is a very limited set of units. However, the combination of these units allows for almost anything to be expressed. The phonemes combine into words, phrases, and sentences according to the rules of the language's grammar to produce an extremely productive system. Contrast this with the kind of communication that non-human species engage in. Birds, bees, and canines are very communicative, but the range of content is limited severely by instinct and design. Another characteristic of human language is that it is somewhat arbitrary. There does not need to be a correspondence between the sound of a word and the idea it expresses. There are a small set of exceptions, words like flit or bonk, which kind of sound like what they are describing, onomatopoeia, but this is a very limited subset. Importantly, our language does not need to have a direct correspondence with the world. This is not true for all communication systems. The bee dance that I discussed earlier is an example of non-arbitrary communication. The direction of the dance indicates the direction of the nectar source relative to the hive, and the duration of the waggle indicates the distance. These attributes are directly related to the environment and constrained by the environment. This is sophisticated communication, but not language as Hackett would describe it. For the most part, the sounds that we use to express an idea bear no relationship to the concrete aspects of the idea. They are, in fact, mental symbols that can link together our perceptual input and concepts. Understanding language as cognition. Language is a remarkably complex set of behaviors. At its core, the challenge of understanding language as a cognitive behavior is trying to understand how humans are able to produce language such that an idea or thought can be converted into speech sounds that can then be perceived by another person and converted back into an idea. Communicative language is essentially a thought transmission system. One person uses language to transmit an idea to another person. The linguistic duality between ideas and how they are expressed is often described as a relationship between the surface structure of communication and the deep structure. Surface structure refers to the words that are used, spoken sounds, phrases, word order, grammar, written letters, etc. The surface structure is what we produce when we speak and what we perceive when we hear. Deep structure, on the other hand, refers to the underlying meaning and semantics of a linguistic entity. These are the thoughts or ideas that you wish to convey via some surface structure. These are the thoughts or ideas that you try to perceive via that surface structure. One of the challenges in terms of understanding this relationship between surface and deep structure is that very often a direct correspondence seems elusive. For example, sometimes different kinds of surface structure give rise to the same deep structure. You can say, "This class is boring," or "This is a boring class," and the underlying deep structure will be approximately the same, despite the slight differences in surface structure. Human language is flexible enough to allow for many ways to say the same thing. The bigger problem comes when the same surface structure can refer to different deep structures. For example, you can say, "Visiting professors can be interesting." In this case, a deep structure that follows from this statement is that when your class is taught by a visiting professor, it is sure to be interesting because visiting professors can be interesting. Another deep structure that comes from exactly the same statement is that attending a party or function at a professor's house is sure to be an interesting event because visiting professors can be interesting. The surrounding context makes it easier, but also suggests a challenge when trying to map surface structure to deep structure. The challenge is how to resolve the ambiguity. Ambiguity in language. Language is full of ambiguity, and understanding how our cognitive system resolves that ambiguity is an incredible challenge. I once saw a headline from the Associated Press regarding a story about commercial potato farmers. It read, "McDonald's fries the Holy Grail for potato farmers." It may look funny, but most of us are quickly able to understand the deep structure here. They are not frying the Holy Grail. Rather, the headline writer uses the term Holy Grail as a metaphor for something that is often elusive, but ultimately an incredible prize. In order to understand this sentence, we need to read it, construct an interpretation, decide if that interpretation is correct, activate concepts about the Holy Grail, activate our knowledge of the metaphoric use of that statement, and finally construct a new interpretation of this sentence. This usually happens in a few seconds and will happen almost immediately when dealing with spoken language, an impressive feat of cognition. Often, when the surface structure leads to the wrong deep structure, it is referred to as a garden path sentence. The garden path metaphor itself comes from the notion of taking a walk in a formal garden along a path that leads either to a dead end or to an unexpected or surprise ending. And that's how garden path sentences work. The most well-known example is the sentence, "The horse raced past, the barn fell." When most people read this sentence, it simply does not make sense, or rather, it makes sense right up to the word barn. As soon as you read the word fell, your understanding of the sentence plummets. The explanation is that as we hear a sentence, we construct a mental model of the idea. Various theories have referred to this as serial sentence parsing, or constraint satisfaction. The serial model, also known as the garden path model, assumes that we use our knowledge of grammar to construct a sentence tree mental model of the sentence as we hear the words. If a word does not fit into the conceptual tree, then we may need to construct a new model. The constraint satisfaction theory suggests that we use our knowledge of what words and ideas co-occur and follow each other in order to arrive at a comprehension. If the more probable interpretation is not the correct one, as in a garden path sentence, then this model also predicts some confusion. In both theories, the central issue is that the representations are constructed as we hear them. As soon as you hear "the horse raced," you construct a mental model of a horse that was racing. You also generate an expectation or inference that something might come after. When you hear "past," you generate a prediction that the horse raced past a thing, which turns out to be the barn. It is a complete idea. When you hear the word "fell," it does not fit with the semantics or the syntactic structure that you created. However, this sentence is grammatically correct and it does have a proper interpretation. It works within a specific context. Suppose that you are going to evaluate some horses. You ask the person at the stable to race the horses to see how well they run. The horse that was raced past the house did fine, but the horse raced past the barn fell. In this context, the garden path sentence makes sense. It is still an ill-conceived sentence, but it is comprehensible in this case. Linguistic inferences. Very often we have to rely on inferences, context, and our own semantic memory in order to deal with ambiguity and understand the deep structure. The same inferential process also comes into play when interpreting the deeper meaning behind seemingly unambiguous sentences. We generate inferences to aid our understanding, and these can also direct our thinking. For example, in the United States, a very popular news outlet is the Fox News Network. When the network launched in the early 2000s, its original slogan was "Fair and Balanced News." There is nothing wrong with wanting to be fair and balanced. It's an admirable attribute in a news organization. But think for a minute about this statement. One possible inference is that if Fox News is fair and balanced, then perhaps its competitors are unfair and unbalanced. It may not explicitly say that, but it may not hurt Fox News' reputation if you make that inference on your own. The slogan, like many slogans, is simple on the surface, but it's designed to encourage inferences like this. In 2003, I was a postdoctoral fellow and attending interviews at many universities, seeking a faculty position. I was interviewed at many places in the United States, which made sense because I was born and raised in the United States, I went to school in the United States, and I was a postdoc in the United States. But like most prospective academics, I considered positions in many geographic areas, including Canada. One interview took place in March 2003 at the University of Western Ontario, which is where I work now. That also happened to be the month when the United States launched what it called the Shock and Awe campaign in Iraq, which was the opening to the U.S.-led military action against Saddam Hussein's government. Not only was this a very big news event, but I also followed it more closely than I might have otherwise done because the campaign began on the very day that I left the United States and flew to Canada for my interview. The war began while I was in flight on the way to Canada. On the one hand, I felt a little awkward being outside the country and being interviewed at a Canadian institution when my own country's government had just launched an attack that was still controversial. Notably, Canada's government at the time did not support the U.S. On the other hand, it gave me a chance to see news coverage of this event from a non-U.S. perspective. Remember that in 2003, although many people were getting news from the internet, it was still relatively uncommon to read or see coverage from media in other parts of the world. Most of us received our news via newspapers and television. One of the things that struck me as being surprising was the terminology used by most newscasters in the United States versus the terminology used by newscasters in Canada. In the United States, media referred to this as the war in Iraq. In Canada, the newscasters were referring it to as the war on Iraq. That single letter change from in to on makes an incredible difference. In the former case, it forces an inference that the U.S. is fighting a war against an enemy that just happens to be in Iraq. The war is not against the country of Iraq or ordinary Iraqis, and indeed you might be helping Iraqis fight a war that they wanted to fight anyway. I think that is exactly how media outlets in the United States wanted this to be perceived. It was promoted by the U.S. as part of the larger war on terror. The Canadian government did not support this war, and the news outlets referred to it as the war on Iraq, suggesting that the United States had essentially declared war on another sovereign country. One could argue that neither term is exactly correct, but the only point I wish to make here is that how the war was being discussed by the news media was going to have an effect on how it is perceived. It was not at all uncommon at the time for many Americans to feel that this was a well-justified military exercise that ultimately was about fighting international terrorists who happened to be based in Iraq. In other words, the U.S. did not declare war on Iraq, the war was just being fought there. How we describe things and how we talk about them can absolutely influence how others think about them. Memory. The interaction between thought and language is complex, and many studies have shown that language use affects the structure and nature of mental representations and the output of many thinking behaviors. Let's consider a classic and well-known example. The eyewitness testimony research conducted by Elizabeth Loftus in the 1970s shows that language use can affect the content of episodic memory. In a series of studies, Loftus investigated how memory can be manipulated and affected by the questions that are being asked. In the most well-known example, subjects were shown videos of car accidents and were then asked about these accidents in follow-up questions. The general procedure might be close to what happens when the police are interviewing eyewitnesses about an event. The accident that subjects were shown was relatively straightforward. It depicted two cars intersecting on a city street. After watching the video, subjects were asked to estimate how fast they thought the cars were going when they intersected, but they were not asked with the term intersected. Subjects instead were asked with one of 5 words: collided, smashed, bumped, hit, or contacted. In other words, all of the subjects saw exactly the same video and were asked about it with the same question, except for the use of a different verb. When subjects were asked to estimate the speed, not surprisingly, those who were asked about how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other estimated higher speeds than those who were asked to say how fast the cars were going when they bumped or hit each other. That one-word change seemed to have an effect on subjects' memory. All of Loftus's subjects saw the same video, and the language manipulation did not occur until afterwards, so the initial encoding of memory should have been the same. But when the memories were retrieved and subjects were asked to make an estimate, the language that was used in the question changed their estimate. The language affected their thinking and their memories. Additional questions revealed that the memories may have been forever tainted by that initial question. A week later, subjects were asked if they remembered any broken glass. The key thing to remember in this particular study is that there was no broken glass in the actual video. However, subjects who were asked to estimate speed with the term smashed were significantly more likely to falsely remember broken glass. Of course, Loftus argued that these kinds of memory errors present a problem for eyewitness testimony because questioning can affect the nature of the memory. It is not a stretch at all to imagine that a detective or police officer, even without meaning to, would permanently affect the status of the memory depending on how the eyewitness was questioned. In other words, in this example, language is clearly having an effect on the mental representations that are being used to answer the questions later on. Analogy and metaphor. Language can also be used effectively via analogy and metaphor to guide understanding. A good analogy relates concepts that may have a similar deep structure, even though they may be different on the surface. Generally, the listener or receiver of the analogy has to attend to the deeper structure to realize these similarities. In the simplest form, if you know that Y is good and you were told that X is analogous to Y, you infer that there is also something good about X. We see examples all the time. I make analogies when I lecture. You probably make analogies when you explain things to people. Let's look at an example from a movie. Most people have seen the movie Shrek from the early 2000s as either a whole movie or parts of it as video clips or memes online. In one scene, Shrek is trying to explain to Donkey why ogres are complex and difficult to understand. He says ogres are like onions, and then later explains that we both have layers. Now I realize that there is few things more annoying than someone explaining why a joke is funny, but I'm going to do this anyway to make a point about analogies. If you've not seen this scene, you can easily find it on YouTube. When Shrek says, ogres are like onions, Donkey initially misunderstands and focuses on the surface similarity and the perceptual qualities of onions. Donkey wonders if ogres are like onions because they smell bad or they make people cry. He transfers the wrong properties to Shrek, but it's funny because they are also properties of ogres. Only later does he understand the analogy that Shrek is trying to make, that ogres and onions have layers, and the outside might be different from the inside. The joke works because it lets Shrek make his deeper analogy at the same time that Donkey makes humorous, surface-level analogies. More concretely, consider an often cited example. An atom is like the solar system. At a certain age, early in primary school, most children have some knowledge about the solar system. They are aware that the sun is large and sits at the center, that planets revolve around the sun, and that possibly some physical force allows this orbit to exist. Presumably, they know less about atomic structure, but knowing that an atom is like the solar system encourages the understanding that each atom has a nucleus and is surrounded by electrons. Also, some physical force allows the structure to be maintained. These two things are very different on the surface, but there are functional and deep similarities that can be explained and understood via metaphor and analogy. In this case, the analogy allows some of the properties of one domain, the solar system, to extend to another domain, the atom. Just as the sun keeps the planets in orbit via the force of gravity, so too does the nucleus keep the electron in check with the Coulomb force. Conceptual metaphor. The linguist George Lakoff has suggested that conceptual metaphors play a big role in how a society thinks of itself and in politics. I gave the example earlier of the war in Iraq versus the war on Iraq, each of which creates a different metaphor. One is an aggressive action taken against or on a country. The other is an aggressive act taking place in a country. Lakoff argues that these conceptual metaphors constrain and influence the thinking process. He gives the example of an argument. One conceptual metaphor for arguments is that an argument is like a war. If you think of arguments in this way, you might say things like, I shot down his arguments, or watch this guy totally destroy climate change denial in 2 minutes. These statements are likely to arise from a conceptual metaphor of arguments as some kind of analogy for warfare. Lakoff also suggests another metaphor for argument, that it is a game of chance. In this case, people might say things like, you win some, you lose some. Lakoff suggests that there is an interaction between a given conceptual metaphor and produced statements and utterances, and that this interaction relates to how we understand the world. There are other examples as well. We generally think of money as a limited resource and a valuable commodity. By analogy, we often think of time in the same way. As such, many of the statements that we make about time reflect this relationship. We might say, you're wasting my time, or I need to budget my time better, or this gadget is a real time saver. According to Lakoff, we say the things we do because we have these underlying conceptual metaphors, and these metaphors are part of our culture. 5.1. Theory in the real world. Lakoff's theory has been influential since it was introduced in the 1980s, but it has taken on some renewed relevance recently since the 2016 election of Donald Trump in the U.S., and also because of the general support for populism in many other countries. Lakoff has been thinking and writing about language and how it affects behavior for decades. His most recent work discusses some of the ways that popular media, news media, and statements by politicians can shape how we think. Being aware of these things is important because we don't want to be misled or duped, but our minds sometimes make it easy. Using some examples from President Trump, Lakoff points out how we can be misled without realizing it. And although he's using President Trump as the primary example, these things can be observed in many politicians. Trump has, however, made this a central part of his governing and campaigning style. One clear example is simple repetition. President Trump repeats terms and slogans so that they will become a part of your concept. He was famous for tweeting, "We're going to win. We're going to win so much. We're going to win at trade. We're going to win at the border. We're going to win so much. You're going to be so sick and tired of winning. You're going to come to me and go, 'Please, please, we can't win anymore.'" There are 7 repetitions of the word win in that speech, and he's repeated statements like that many times since. We also hear and see repetitions of statements like fake news and no collusion, etc. Lakoff argues that the simple repetition is the whole goal. Even if you don't believe the president, you are still taking in these words and concepts, and they are often amplified by people commenting and retweeting. The president is adept at controlling the conversation by framing people and ideas. He seems to do this in 2 ways. One is with his use of nicknames, Crooked Hillary, for example, to refer to former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Crooked taps into a cognitive metaphor of untruthfulness in which we think that truth is straight. By calling her crooked and repeating that, it might seem silly, but it still has the desired effect of reinforcing the concept that she is neither truthful nor trustworthy. Even the president's slogan, "Make America Great Again," is very loaded with linguistic reference, implying that it was great in the past, that it's not great now, and that the president's actions will make it great again in the way it was great before. Lakoff suggests that we should all be aware of how these things influence our thinking. We may not agree with the president, but according to Lakoff, these repetitions and the use of framing and metaphors will create the associations anyway. The more times you hear them, the stronger the memory becomes. And this is not just the case with President Trump. Lakoff's messages apply to other leaders, politicians, and media. If you're reading this in the UK, the Netherlands, India, or South Africa, these examples can be extended, and they will likely apply as well. For better or worse, language influences how we think about things. It causes us to strengthen some representations and create new memories. It activates schemas and concepts. It causes us to make inferences and draw conclusions, and it makes us able to be coerced and misled. The best defense against being misled is knowing why this happens and how to recognize it.